This afternoon, I have the pleasure, I'm Tim Schroeder from CTI, and I have the pleasure to moderate the panel discussion. And in just a moment, we'll have the panelists introduce themselves and also give a bit of background on their role in their organization. But I've got the pleasure, I think, of hosting probably the largest panel. Remains to be seen if we're the best panel, but we get I think, the credit for the most chairs on the stage. But we're going to highlight European clinical trials involving cell and gene therapies in the context of global development. And I think you'll agree it's a very distinguished group of people and a very diverse set of backgrounds here. So without any further ado, we'll start with the introductions, and we'll go with Ian and go all the way down.
Hello, I'm Ian Hudson, the CEO of the MHRA, the regulatory body in the UK. We do a lot in the advanced therapies area, both in terms of the clinical trials that happen in the UK we approve, but also through the support for innovation that we give through the Regulatory Centre and also through the National Institute for Biological Standards and Control, which is also part of the agency.
Thanks, Ian.
Hi, so I'm Nathalie Morgensztejn. I'm a European regulator, and in fact I work at the French National Agency for Medicine and Health Products, and I've been involved in the benefit risk assessment of drugs for more than 20 years, and mainly in the field of virology, and I much more recently entered into the field of gene therapy because it's also a very dynamic field. And so since 3 years, and in fact, I see a really parallel with both biology and gene therapy. First, because there are viral vectors, but also because it's a very dynamic field, and there are particular expectations from patients, and so there are a lot of challenges, and it's very stimulating.
Thank you.
My name is Ilona Reischl. I work for the Austrian National Competent Authority. And I think most pertinent to this panel is that I've been involved in clinical trials in general, but also ATMP trials, both from a general approval perspective, but also as a quality assessor. And I think coming from a smaller agency where rather than structures, you have separate, distinguished people who are involved in the process is also a slightly different perspective.
Thank you very much.
I'm Martina Schüssler-Lenz. I joined the Paul-Ehrlich-Institut as a physician in 2005, and I joined there the department that is responsible for the assessment of ATMPs. So I've followed the pre-authorization steps of ATMPs from the area of national advice towards clinical trial assessment. And then since 2017, I'm the chair of the Committee for Advanced Therapies. That is the committee at the European Medicines Agency that is responsible for the assessment and of marketing authorizations of ATMPs. So yeah, I'm here today in my role as more in my role, I guess, as a person being involved with clinical trials. But the good thing is that for those that have these both roles on the national level, but also at the EMA level, that we can see really the gene and cell therapy developments from the very early stages when academics or SMEs, in former times more SMEs, now also more larger pharmaceutical companies come for national advice with a view to clinical trial authorization, and to follow that up to the stage where the products come for marketing authorization. And it's a privilege, I think, to work as a regulator in such a position where since the start of the Committee for Advanced Therapies in 2009, now we have 10 years of CUT. You have 10 years of ARM. We have 10 years of CUT. To see how the area has evolved, we've approved until 2008 10 ATMPs on the European level, central marketing authorization, as you know, for all of these products. Then in 2018, 3 products, and now we're expecting a steady increase in products coming for marketing authorization. So it's it's a privilege, in my view, to work in this area, and very much looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Martina. I want to circle back to that increasing demand in part of our discussion. And Katsuaki, you are last but not least here for your introduction.
Okay, so I'm Katsuaki Ura, Deputy Director of Office of International Regulatory Affairs in MHRA Japan. I was responsible for evaluation of ATMPs for several months ago in my organization. I'd be pleased to have opportunity to speak here today. Okay, that's all.
Thank you. Well, just a little background. In preparation for this, we solicited topics from a number of sources, including the panelists. We also solicited from some of the ARM member companies. And then finally, Annie Hubre, who is the Senior Director of Committees and Public Policy for ARM, recently completed a survey which the group here has had a chance to see. I think it will be presented and published probably at some upcoming ARM meetings, but it specifically dealt with some questions around submissions and interactions with regulatory authorities in the EU on some of these trials. So I think we'll use all of those topics kind of to inform today's discussion. But I'll start off with a question or topic that came up, which was asking the panel to provide your views on the approval of CT applications, specifically across the ATMPs, and talk about the reasons for variability that you see and maybe suggestions for how to improve that. And we'll jump right in with anybody who wants to answer to start with here.
Shall I perhaps start? We see a lot of clinical trial applications for advanced therapies in the UK. I think last year we approved 65. I think there's something like 85 clinical trials in advanced therapies going on in the UK. Our advice to anyone thinking about this area is come and talk to us early about it. We have an innovation office, we've got clinical trials helpline, we've got scientific advice processes. We're very keen to see these products developed for the benefit of public health, but developed safely and appropriately such that they'll be suitable for regulatory purposes and get registration in due course. So for us, we've got rapid timings, etc., but come and talk to us early before you put in your application if it's going to be remotely controversial or difficult, and then we can work with you to make sure that you tick all the boxes, you do all you need, you generate the data you need, and then that facilitates the whole process. The worst thing from our point of view is to get an application coldly put on our desk that we've not seen before, and it's horribly complicated and controversial, and then you're going to get a no, and then let's talk about it. But we're very open to the discussions.
Ian, one of the things I hear said, to echo what you said, is come early and come often.
Yes.
Do you also believe in the frequent interactions?
Absolutely. We're here, there. We want to see these products developed as optimally as possible. We've put all sorts of mechanisms in place, the Innovation Office, scientific advice, etc., clinical trials helpline, clinical trials unit, have lots of meetings every year. We want to make sure that things are done properly, safely, and therefore come talk to us and we'll make sure that we're happy, and then that smooths the whole process.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Other comments?
Yeah, I could only echo what Jan just said. I think that indeed, I think that the more earlier we are familiar with drug development and in fact the complexity of the drug and the better it is. I think that so it's very important that we have interaction. So it's and it could be dedicated interaction, for example, on the quality aspect on clinical. So as soon as there is the development going on, so we can meet with developers, and so it could be a teleconference or something. And also it depends on how it has been prepared, how specific are the questions, so that we could have a stabilized response to the developers. And I think that that is very important to have this interaction, because I will say that as a regulator, I think that has already say that, but in fact the most challenge is that in drug regulation, there is not such a large experience in gene therapy. And in fact, so we see that in the three last years, as Guido already said, so we have the free marketing authorization. So finally, the field is entering into concrete applications. And I'm very lucky because I enter into the field while the field is entering into concrete applications. So it's very important. And I think that also we need to see what are the expectations from patients? So to what extent you are interacting with patients, with physicians, and that is very important to have this kind of feedback.
And I wonder, Ilona or Martina, the issue of maybe getting different advice from different groups. Could you speak to any suggestions you might have about how to make that a little bit more consistent?
If I may, sorry.
Ilona, go ahead. No.
I was just going to continue, but you can go ahead. Now, I think pretty much every European agency, national agency, has innovation offices, has scientific advice. So that is principally open. The scientific advices also are supplied as part of clinical trial submissions. So that already gives you a picture of what other agencies thought about the product, which can always be very helpful. So if you've done it, submit it. I think also the nature of the question changes. Early on, it's administrative. How do you need to line up various approvals if you're dealing with a GMO, for example? Whereas later on, you go into more detailed questions. So I think there is a national progression, and of course, it's product specific. And as to the divergence in opinion, I think that one of the contributing factor might be if you're dealing with an assessor that is seeing marketing authorizations and what the issues were and clinical trials, and to which extent in a given country innovation is dominant. I mean, I come from a country that is probably not the most innovation-friendly population-wise. So when you submit a trial, patient safety is the dominant factor, but also reproducibility of the data. And so depending on the level of characterization of your product, you might end up with a reproducible or not reproducible clinical trial. And I think that is also a grayscale.
That's a really interesting point on the innovation friendliness. Martina, you were going to?
Yeah, so I think in terms of two things, national advice, and the other thing is then the harmonization or lack of harmonization of clinical trial authorization. I think there are the two topics that you may be interested to hear some views from us. In terms of national advice prior to clinical trial authorization, that's important, of course. We see companies that go to 3 or 4 different national authorities for advice before they then submit their clinical trial authorizations to get the views from the different national authorities. That is something that we see quite frequently for early phase trials. We see that companies would more or less go to one national agency to that country where they intend to do the first in-man clinical trial. For Germany, Paul-Ehrlich-Institut is responsible for these products, and we've established in 2009 the Innovation Office. We have now more than 1 national advice meeting for ATMPs per week. So numbers are increasing, and we have to make a strong effort to keep pace with the demand on these for these advice meetings. With regard to harmonization, well, I think that's more of a question to the companies, to the audience, whether they get, if they go to 3 different national authorities, if they get more or less the same answers to their question, or whether there are differences. I think at the end, it gives if that's the approach, it gives a good opportunity to design a clinical trial and to submit the best possible dossier in order to get the clinical trial approved. And the other thing then is, are we harmonized in Europe in terms of clinical trial approval timelines? And but that, I think, is something that we should also touch and discuss a little bit. Because at the moment, obviously, there is some divergence noted in terms of timelines. We know that there are countries, member states, that are faster and others are less swift in getting the clinical trial approved, and that has different reasons, which I guess we're going to discuss.
Katsuraki-san, anything from the Japanese perspective on this topic?
Okay. At first, of course, the scientific advice scheme is very important in Japan as well. And I'd like to mention this. For example, innovative clinical trial design is developing in all over the world, such as umbrella trial and basket trial. And reporting of adverse effect in clinical trials is somewhat complex in Japan. So I'd like to streamline the reporting system. For example, a lot of companies report to PMDA the adverse reaction. So I think we can improve this situation. So, and we would like to make effort to streamline the requirement for developing circumstance. Thank you.
Do you ascribe to Ian's view of come as early as possible for the sponsor companies to start interacting with you and your team? Yeah. Good. I think as preparation for this, I can't recall if it was Martina or Ilona suggested that we reach out to some of the sponsors that CTI works with and ask their specific questions. And 3 or 4 of the sponsors specifically came back to me and said, ask your panel, do we believe that new guidelines on quality, non-clinical, and clinical aspects, will they streamline the process, or is this just extra bureaucracy? And so, not to put anybody on the spot here, Nathalie, but I'll start with you. Do you think this is are we going to see improvements here?
I think that it's a basis to attempt harmonization, but we know that I think that every construct raised different questions, and I always say, in fact, as also Guido has said in the introduction, I think that Guido Razi said that safety starts by quality, and I think that so indeed we have the lines. But each construct and its developers is different approach, and I think that it's very specific questions. But at least I think that it gives the orientation for attempting harmonization. And we will expect that there is harmonization, and also there is that the guidance will be helpful for developers. That is the reason why it has been built. And then the field is moving forward, and also more applications that we have. We have recently had the CAR T cells, and so we learn from each applications. And in fact, in France, for example, I am the head of my department, so cover all the life cycle of a drug. So we see the drug from the clinical trial and to the temporary authorization and the marketing application. So we have all the issues in terms of quality non-clinical and clinical, and that brings new informations. And so, but at least the guidelines give orientations, and I think that it is helpful for both for developers and also for the harmonization in terms in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
I think that guidelines is one way that we try to provide support, and I would. There are 2 guidelines out for public consultation on the EMA homepage. One is the guideline on quality, non-clinical, and clinical development for genetically modified cells, with a focus on CAR T cells, where I would take the opportunity here to encourage you to look at that guideline and send us comments. And the other one is a guideline that also you find on the EMA homepage on investigational ATMPs. So that's a guideline on quality, non-clinical and clinical aspects for ATMPs when you're for the clinical trial approval. So that is that guideline is also open for consultation, and it is very important for us to get developers' feedback, and then that gives us a chance to build the comments in. Guidelines are important, I think, and I think it's also one of our important tasks as regulators to write these guidelines, but they can only, as was said, be a general, give general guidance for an ATMP development, be it cell-based or gene therapy product, and then what is the real, the art, I would say, that for a specific product, you take the principles of that guideline, but then you adapt your clinical trial or your clinical development program to the specificities. So it's always, of course, a case-by-case and very product-specific decision to then. But I think that with the guidelines, with the advice, national advice, EMA advice, everything that has been set up in Europe, with the prime system, we have quite now a good system, especially for ATMPs, to help developers. So I hope that that's been also, from your side, being looked at and taken on board.
Anna, you could.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in terms of harmonization, you should never underestimate the achievement by actually discussing a guideline and writing the guideline, because that drives discussion and interaction, and it's not just within the CAPT, it's also with the CTFG. So writing a guideline has an effect. The comments coming back have an effect. And I think all that builds harmonization. And in addition, I think what probably should be mentioned is that that curricula are being developed for assessors on a European level, and that's the NTC training program, which is internal. So there are a lot of activities to foster harmonization, not just on the marketing authorization level, but also on the clinical trial level. Also activities by the CTFG. So I think the more products we have, the more case examples we have, all that will foster harmonization.
Yeah. I think, at least from a few of the people that I talked to, the concern was, as was pointed out, we've got an increasing demand of more products going in front of you, and possibly the harmonization process is not being completed. And then you couple that with some of the other things like EMA moving and things like that, are we going to end up with an extreme backlog where even today's timelines may not be achievable in the near future? But it sounds like you're cautiously optimistic that it's not going to be the case.
I think it's rather the opposite. I mean, times are challenging, particularly for small agencies, because we have the clinical trial regulation, we have the device regulations. Everything is we have Brexit. Everything is happening at the same time. And so if you have only very few people involved in a certain field, that is a huge challenge. But I don't think that it'll impact on harmonization.
Okay, great. Ian, were you going to?
Just on that topic, I think guidelines have a place, but technology is moving on very fast in this area, and it's important then, it'll be a challenge to make sure that the guidelines try to keep up with the space of the speed of change. And guidelines are guidelines, they're not law, and therefore if it doesn't fit with your product, then justify why not. But you don't have to rigidly follow them, you have to justify why not if it doesn't fit. And it does not replace coming for proper discussion and scientific advice.
Yeah. So briefly on that note, when you submit your clinical trial, please tell the story. Do not just submit the minimum, because we have not been involved in your development. We have not seen what you've done and what has failed. So if you would be slightly more expansive in how you got to the point where you are when you submit the trial, I think that would also be very beneficial.
I think that's important advice. Sometimes I hear our regulatory friends telling us that people don't understand what the word brief means in a briefing packet. So you're telling us we really need to be in the middle ground, not so brief that in fact the story is not told, but obviously if we end up with volumes, it's not going to serve anybody's purpose.
Yeah, I think that it is all the more important that remember that we only have one list of questions. So in fact, if the packaging is not complete enough, so then I think that the response will raise additional questions, and then we have time constraint and one list of questions. So I think that that is why I think that when you have kind of deviation from guidelines and so on. So the pre-discussion with regulators is important, and also to best prepare the formal submission. Yeah.
Nathalie, while you've got the floor, there was one or two people that were quite interested in the new French regulations around fast-track review. I wonder if you could educate us a little more on that and maybe give your experience so far. I think there's 2 different tracks, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, so it is in response to the government, the French government, that wanted to have more clinical trials in France and to have more French patients who have access to innovative treatments. So, and we did that. So it has been very recently put in place in February. And so there are 2 types: fast track 1 for new applications and for new product. And fast track 2, which correspond to, for example, if you have a CAR T cell that is already registered, or you have already a clinical trial with a dose and the same manufacturing process, so you do not have the non-clinical and quality aspects, but only the patient populations that differ. So it could be a fast track 2 because it's faster. So it's 110 days for a fast track 1, which is a new application with a new product, and fast track 2, which is there is no non-clinical and quality aspect, but only a clinical aspect. Is 60 days, and we try to have this. This kind of dichotomy approach to facilitate. So here is to help developers and to facilitate for fast track 2, and fast track 1 is more global with non-clinical quality and clinical aspect. But it's not for when there is a medical device. So there are limitations, but overall it is in macro it's like that to try to speed up the access and for patients.
And have you had some products go through already at this point?
In fact, so we already have a discussion with on a fast track 2, and so yes, so it's for a product that for which it's only the patient population that differ, but it's the same dose and same manufacturing process.
That's really good to hear.
Yeah.
I think sometimes the view in these type of meetings is that from the audience perspective, it's hearing the experts' opinions or responses to some of the questions, but I would submit, while that's really important, the equal importance, I think, is sometimes being able to meet these type of individuals in the hallway afterwards and really start to establish a relationship. I think we find that is really critical to moving things forward. I had the opportunity this morning, I visited the European bone marrow transplant unit, which is literally a 10-minute or so walk from here. And I was struck, the individual we met with said he watched yesterday's session online. And we tend to think in terms of it's the people attending the meeting, but obviously both the recordings and the online version open up these panels to a much larger audience than you sometimes think.
Yeah, I think that we all are dealing, I think that we need to have synergy. And for the patient interest. So I think that, so that is why I think that it's very important to have the academic view, the developer views, and the patient's view as well. I think that it has been said more this day than the prior day. In fact, the patient view is very important. I know that from, being involved in the HIV field, and we knew with Jan at the CHMP level and so on the biology and the patient expectations is very important to hear, and how to liaise with uncertainties. So it's a collective view of how liaising with uncertainties. So I think that that is very important to meet each other and to as also it has been said by the GSK representative. So we do not have all the responses, but at least we want to hear from you how what kind of uncertainties you have, and then how you think that despite of these uncertainties, it is still compatible to give access to the patients, and that is something that we need to clearly hear from developers.
Thank you. I think in prepping for this, Ian was one who mentioned that we should make sure there are plenty of opportunities for the audience. So I'll ask one more question and then we'll open it up to the audience. So start to think of your questions for the panel. But last part of the discussion, in some of the interactions prior to this meeting, there was questions regarding the GMO approval that's required for all the trials involving gene therapy. And I think the disconnect or the question from some of the sponsors involved, what is the relationship and the communication between yourselves and some of the GMO discussions, and how does that generally go? If you could educate us, it would be helpful.
I can.
Yeah. Well, let me maybe briefly mention that there is that's differently handled in the different member states, but there are some member states that have talked during the clinical trial authorization process to the respective GMO authority, and that then at the end, when you get the clinical trial authorization, you have also the GMO era authorization. And Germany is one example where this is done, where you don't have to deal in that process with two different bodies. There are other member states where that is being done. Overall, we have realized on the European level that there is need for harmonization, because for these GMO gene therapy developments, for people, applicants to deal with 28 different member states and 28 different GMO authorities is a pain. So we have that initiative has started 2 years ago together with the European Commission to do a repository, and that's on the European Commission homepage, on the GMO requirements in the different member states. On top of that, to harmonize requirements by means of having a harmonized application form, and that has been achieved for genetically modified cells, and that's been now also developed between the member states, the European Commission, people in the Committee for Advanced Therapies, people on the national level for other gene therapy products. So the problem has been recognized and it's been worked on. That's the message, and we hope that in the next years we are confident that things will improve in the European Union on that regard.
Great. Ilona?
I think so. My conclusion is, at the moment we've tried to achieve harmonization on anything that doesn't require a change of the legislation nationally. But I can tell you, for example, in Austria, the legislation will be revised, but we've been waiting on what the consensus is on the European level, obviously, before we change the national legislation. So we have a quite complicated setup in theory, if you look at the documents, but I can tell you that through personal interaction with our colleagues, we've actually achieved a really efficient process, in spite of not yet optimal legal interplay.
Thank you. Ian, you were going to make a comment?
Yes, I think certainly in the UK environment it seems to work quite smoothly. They're parallel processes. One isn't linked to the other. You can't get one bit without the other. They're entirely parallel processes. Just one word that we need to reflect on in relation to guidance in this area. I know that one concern is that if we need to be careful we don't up the requirements across the board for everyone and therefore make it a bit harder for everyone. And I know there's some sort of little bit of concern and reluctance at our end on that side of things. It seems to work for us just fine without that. I know in some countries it's not working so well, but we just need to be careful that we don't make it more difficult for everyone.
Yeah, that's an important point. having a standardization that's so high doesn't help.
Standardized to the lowest
Yeah.
or highest, whatever you, whichever way you look at it.
Katsuaki-san, did you have any comments to that?
GMO, okay. I'm sorry, but it is difficult to mention for me because it is under consideration internally. But harmonization is initiated by conversation between among regulators. So I would like to have a conversation and a discussion among us.
Thank you. Nathalie?
Just to say shortly that so we are in close collaboration with the GMO bodies, and in fact, and we could involve them into the pre-discussion and so on. So I think that so to best prepare, the parallel assessment here.
Okay. Audience questions. I think we've got a microphone. Got one right here. It's really hard to see with the lights.
Hi, I'm Virginie Eggeman from Bluebird Bio. I have a question about the future clinical trial regulation that I think will eventually be in place, hopefully 2020 or maybe a little bit later after that. I was wondering if you had thought about how you would manage ATMPs through that new process and whether there would be opportunity for national regulators to get together maybe as a cluster to review ATMP applications for clinical trials to eventually sort of harmonize the assessment. Any comments or thoughts on that?
Go right ahead.
Well, yes, I think that's a good and an important question because with the new clinical trials regulation, the time that applicants have to answer questions is going to be shortened. From now in Germany, we have 90 days for applicants to answer all the questions to then 12 days. And if you consider that in general, you get like, 50, 60 questions for a clinical trial. That will be a challenge for the applicants to answer those. While for the assessment time for us is not shortened because there is a special rule for ATMPs. So we have like 90 days assessment and then you only 12 days. That needs to be worked on, and there are thoughts about combined multinational advice in view of the clinical trial regulation that is being discussed in the EU Innovation Network. And there are also thoughts from individual member states to, prepare applicants to a point that once they file a clinical trial, there will be no further questions because everything has been discussed before. But from my point, I cannot be more specific on that. But there are a lot of, we are considering that something needs to be done in order to allow that the things are, the responses come in these 12 days.
Ilona?
Yeah, I just want to say, the clinical trial regulation process in principle is collaborative, and that is product independent. So there might be some distinct features for ATMPs, the possibility to extend timelines, but in principle, the review is collaborative. I think what's going to help is the more ATMP products come, the more local agencies have a justification to have a dedicated reviewer for ATMPs. Because up till now, if you have 10 trials a year, that doesn't necessarily justify a full-time reviewer specifically for ATMPs. So the more products come, the more experienced people will be. And even now, the people reviewing ATMPs know each other on a European level. The number is not that great. We are already in interaction on the level of the CTFG, on the level of the CAT. And so knowledge is permeated and difficulties are being discussed even now. So I think it's a natural progression.
That's a really, really excellent point. I think we had a question here.
Working? Okay. Hi, it's Patrick Ginty from the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult. We referred earlier to the new medical device regulation coming into force. And I just wondered what the perceived impact that might be on data requirements for clinical trials for combined ATMPs. I'm thinking more along the lines of combined ATMPs where the device component may not be a separate CE-marked device, but actually an important part of the product itself.
That's the question for Ilona.
Well, I can tell you that because these products haven't happened that frequently, maybe the experience is limited. I can tell you that in Austria, since the same division within the agency handles drug and device trials, for us it would be no problem to just register the trial as combined trial. So in a setting where the device is not CE marked or outside its intended use, and the medicinal product is also not approved, we would just go the route of a combined trial, and we would have no problem at all dealing with that. And I think that is a situation that you will find in many other member states, although that hasn't yet been a focused discussion on the European level. But I believe that is going to come, because we all have to deal with the device regulation, and in fact also with the IVDR. So assays in clinical trials is also a big topic that is not an ATMP specific topic, and that is being discussed on a European level very actively at the moment.
I think that
Go ahead.
just say that in fact in France, so we already have ATMP clinical trials with the medical device and for in ophthalmology, and so I think that indeed, so we have dedicated department. But we work on in parallel, so it's a kind of project as soon as we see the clinical trial application arriving with that.
Can I just correct myself, because I'm sort of, if it is in the context of a combined ATMP, it would obviously only be under the medicines legislation. I was also thinking about ATMPs combining as container closures or application devices, a more complicated setting. And in that setting, you would have the combined trial. But if it's a combined ATMP, then the entire product falls under the medicines legislation. Mm. And the requirements would be questions on whether the device component would comply with the essential requirements of the current or future device legislation.
I think, Ian, you had a MHRA perspective?
I think we've put out some guidance in relation to this on our website in relation to the existing medical device regulations, and we will be putting some out in the future in relation to the new medical device regulations. And it's an area where I think developers thinking about this probably ought to be speaking to regulators earlier, particularly regulators where you can bring both devices and medicines together.
Any other questions in the audience? I think we have time for one more. Back in the corner.
Yes, thank you very much. Andrew Hobbs from Huron Consulting. I just got a question about orphan drug legislation. I just wondered what the panel's view was on orphan drug exclusivity in this space and what impact that might have on the sort of commercial competitiveness and levels of investment that might go into this area, depending on how it gets applied.
That's a difficult one. I just can refer, the ATMPs that come to us for marketing authorization, they are by majority products with the orphan designation, and we're dealing with it. We have to deal with it on the level of course, within the frame of the orphan regulation. We have looked at the topic of similarity, of structural molecular similarity, and have there is a document out at the level of the European Commission. For example, with the question, if you have a CAR T cell with a targeting CD19, how much, and you have already a CD19 targeting CAR T cell approved, how much would the similar molecular structure or differences in molecular structure impact on the future orphan status. That we have dealt with, but apart from that, we have to deal with the regulation as it is. Nothing else that I can say.
I'm not so sure that the considerations are that different to the considerations more broadly for the orphan legislation, which is, by and large, it's been very good at facilitating development for rare diseases, but there are some examples where it hasn't worked so well and has resulted in some very expensive medicines that were previously available as chemicals that not very much has changed. But by and large, I think there are many diseases for which products have been developed that wouldn't have otherwise had them. So, okay, there's the technical considerations of when the next one comes along, yes, but the general principles, I think, are probably much the same, I think. Unless the panel disagrees with me, I think they probably are.
Anybody else want a last comment to that? I think our time is up. I'd like to thank the panel for their participation.